Welcome to the 9th episode of Masters and Matches with me, Peter Doggers.
And me, Arne Moll. This was the tournament of my life. I achieved an unprecedented rating performance of 3,000. 9 wins, 4 draws and no losses in a world-class event is a result for the Guinness Book of Record. That year, 12 was a lucky number for me. It was the 12th tournament in Linares, and it is well known that I was the 12th world champion. That's a quote from Anatoly Karpov from his book My Best Games. And he writes that as an introduction to a game played in Linares 1994, which is the topic of this episode.
Yeah, one of the most famous tournaments in chess history, especially because of that amazing result by Karpov. A tournament played in an interesting year in many regards. To be honest, when I see the number 1994, I always somehow have to think about the fact that it was actually an amazing year in Hollywood. It's good for pub quizzes, stuff like this, because it's the year when Pulp Fiction, Forrest Gump and The Shawshank Redemption came out. One of the best years maybe ever for the big screen.
Yeah, indeed.
More popular culture. It was also the year Friends debuted on television. It was the year that Kurt Cobain died. And, if we look at the politics in the world of those days, Bill Clinton was president in the United States and Boris Yeltsin was the leader in the Soviet Union, which actually had a bit of a complicated political situation. A year later, you would be in Russia, right?
Yes, I lived for a while in St. Petersburg in 1995, and it was a very chaotic period, I think, the early 90s. The country was really in turmoil. There was a lot of instability, a lot of crime. And I think the first private corporations started to rise. And there was a lot of, dubious businessmen, a lot of complex politics. I think the first Chechen war was also in 1994. So really a lot going on in Russia and the former Soviet Union.
Mm-hmm. And also a complicated situation in the chess world, by the way, because we had the famous times of the split in the chess world, which was from a year before when Garry Kasparov and Nigel Short stepped away from FIDE, had their own match for the World Championship. Kasparov beat Short. And because of that, a FIDE World Championship match was played between Karpov and Jan Timman, won by Karpov. So in a way, we sort of had two separate world champions. And as we also mentioned in the podcast about Toiletgate, this situation basically stayed like this until 2006.
Yeah, speaking of Jan Timman, he was one of the former winners of the tournament that we're going to discuss, the Linares tournament in Spain. He won the tournament in 1988. Linares was known originally as the Wimbledon of Chess. This is a term that's now often used for the Wijk aan Zee tournament. But at the time, in the 80s and the 90s, the Linares tournament was considered to be the strongest tournament in the world. So after Timman, there were some very well-known winners as well. In 1989, it was Ivanchuk, a very young Vasily Ivanchuk, who won at the age of 20 ahead of Karpov. Do you remember, Peter, who won in 1990?
Well, Kasparov is always a good guess, and in this case, it's also the right guess.
Yeah.
But maybe more famously is Vasily Ivanchuk's second win in Linares in '91, because in that year not only Karpov but also Kasparov were participating, and I still remember Ivanchuk beating Kasparov in a Sicilian with Bishop B5, very famous game, and the second early success for a player who is still among our favorites. We are still big fans of Ivanchuk, and who isn't, right?
Yeah, 1990 Kasparov won, and he also won in 1992 and 1993. So the tournament we're going to discuss, the 1994 tournament, I think it was also the expectation that Kasparov would once again win. But let's see if that was the case.
Yeah, so let's have a look at who were playing in '94. And it was, in fact, the strongest tournament ever held over 14 players. It was ridiculously strong, I might say. We had PCA world champion Garry Kasparov, number 1 in the world rated, although not officially FIDE rated. Can you explain this?
Yeah, he, of course, played his PCA match against Short, and FIDE basically didn't want to publish his rating nor shorts.
Right. Well, he was, of course, still considered to be the number 1 rated player. And, well, number 2 rated player, FIDE world champion Anatoly Karpov. There were also the numbers 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and 9 of the world playing. And those were Vishy Anand, Alexei Shirov, Vasily Ivanchuk, Vladimir Kramnik, Gata Kamsky, Evgeny Bereyev, and Boris Gelfand.
So I think the only player in the top 10 that was not participating in Linares 94 was Valery Salov. Peter, what was the reason he didn't play?
Yeah, Salov, we haven't heard from him for ages, but he was indeed one of the best players in the world back then. And he was from Russia, but he was at the time living in Spain, in fact, in Linares. And when doing research for this podcast, I read somewhere that Salov had recently left his house. He had moved away from his house in Linares, and someone had discovered that he had left behind 3 trophies that he had won in Linares. I'm assuming that those were trophies from maybe the open tournaments or something like that. Mm-hmm. But he had left those trophies and didn't bring them to his new place. And apparently the tournament director, Luis Rentero, was really not amused when he found out about that. Yeah, and this was basically the reason why Salov wasn't invited. And I think Rentero even said something like, why didn't he just take them with him in the car and then throw him out of the car? Just leaving them like that is showing no respect, and therefore I cannot invite him.
Wow.
So I think this was the story.
Wow. So who did he invite instead of Salov?
Well, there's a few more players that I haven't mentioned yet participating. Those were Alexander Beljavsky, world number 16, Veselin Topalov, number 20, the best female player in the world, Judith Polgar, at the time world number 22, and Joël Laucher from France, world number 26, and finally the best player from Spain, world number 68, Miguel Illescas.
Wow, so a very strong field, including the strongest woman player.
Yeah, that was actually a 17-year-old Judith Polgar invited to her very first super tournament.
So Peter, before we move on, I think you've been to Linares. I've been in many cities in Spain, but not in Linares, but you have been. Can you say something about that city and maybe also the playing venue?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've been there twice, and it's the city itself is not particularly interesting. It's a bit of a industrial workers town in the south of Spain, but the place I still really enjoyed being there because the hotel was still there. We're talking about the years 2008, 2009. And at that time, the tournament was already not being held in the hotel anymore, but in the Cervantes Theater. But I'm talking about Hotel Hannibal, which is named after the Carthaginian conqueror Hannibal, who crossed the Alps, but conquered his love, Himilce, in Linares. Ah. And for example, the restaurant in that hotel was named after this Himilce. And I still remember the doors opening, those glass doors still having those having chess-themed images graved in the door, and there were a lot of beautiful chess portraits hanging on the walls. So you could really smell the enormous tradition of a tournament that was actually first held in 1978, and the last edition was in 2010. And when I started with Chess Vibes and filming in Wijk aan Zee in 2007, a month later, my good friend Macaulay Peterson took my camera and traveled to Linares and made his first reports on that tournament. And I think the next 2 years after that, I myself traveled there. And I also vividly remember seeing Ljubomir Ljubojevic for the first time there in the press room, which was also a great experience.
Yeah. And have you also met Rentero, the organizer?
I didn't meet him personally, but I do remember seeing him walking around. I think that was either in the press room or the playing hall. But we did publish a little bit about him on my Chess Vibes website back then. In 2011, we had an article written by Rick Goedzee, a Dutch player and writer who did a nice piece for us because he was visiting the tournament back then. And he had, for example, a piece about Luis Rentero, who told him, "I started delivering groceries to several villages by motorbike. Then I bought a large storage facility and it grew from there. I owned 32 supermarkets and 4 hotels. I sold the supermarkets to a Belgian company, but still have my hotels. Hotel Hannibal is the only one with a chess theme, but sometimes visitors to my other hotels bring me chess memorabilia as they know I love the game."
Yeah, Rentero was a pretty remarkable figure, I think, right? He was very vocal and very present. And I think he also had a very strong desire to see fighting chess.
Yeah, definitely. He didn't just want to see fighting chess games, he demanded them, and he had the power to demand those. In fact, he even gave financial penalties to players who drew too quickly to his taste.
Yeah.
Or even also sometimes gave cash bonuses for players involved in long games. Another part from the previously mentioned article on Chess Vibes has something about this. Glowing with pleasure, he tells the story that he even fined Kasparov once. The world champion had just made a draw in 32 moves when Rantero informed him that he would withhold 500,000 pesetas from his prize money. Kasparov was beside himself with anger. "It's my friend who does this to me. I will never play in Linares again." Rantero didn't budge. Kasparov paid his fine and did return the following year.
So a bit more background on the 94 edition, because not only the players were there, but some of them had also brought their seconds. Kasparov had brought Vladimir Dvorkovich, which was the father of the current FIDE president, and he had also brought Sergei Makarichev. Karpov had brought Mikhail Podgayets. Gatakamsky was with his father, Rustam, who always accompanied him at chess tournaments, but later they became embroiled. At the time, though, Rustam was still there.
Yeah, Kamsky, by the way, also Karpov's opponent a few years later in 1996 FIDE World Championship.
And Veselin Topalov, who turned 19 on the day of the closing ceremony, he was already with Silvio Danailov. And we met both of them in the Toiletgate episode at length.
Yeah, and then of course there was also, as we already mentioned, Judith Polgar was there in her first super tournament. And she came with her older sister Susan, who was still named Zsuzsa back then, and their mother Clara. So yeah, the tournament was between February 23 and March 14, 1994. It was 13 rounds, logically, because 14 players, just like in Wijk aan Zee. However, it was a tournament with no fewer than 7 rest days.
Wow.
Yeah, in Wijk aan Zee it's always 3 rest days, and that seems sometimes more than enough. But 7, I think it definitely played a role that we were still talking about a tournament that still had adjournments.
Yes.
Games that would simply be ended after the time control, and moves would be put in a sealed envelope, and the position would simply be resumed on another time, on another moment, and it was usually on one of those rest days.
Yeah, makes sense.
So it was a very long tournament, but it was also a very strong tournament, with an average ELO rating of 2685, which was the highest ever at the time. And because this tournament was so strong, a few days before, Kasparov came with a very interesting quote. Arne, tell us.
Yeah, he basically said that the winner of this tournament could rightly be called the world champion of tournaments. Interesting title, and especially interesting if you take into consideration the big debates about the world championship matches going on at the same time.
Right. As we said, Kasparov was PCA world champion, Karpov was FIDE world champion. So apparently there was a desire in all kinds of ways to determine who of them was the best. And apparently he was also interested in answering the question, who is the best tournament player, right?
So sounds like Kasparov was full of self-confidence, right?
Yeah, indeed. And well, as it turns out, Karpov was also feeling pretty well. The famous Spanish chess journalist Leoncio Garcia met with Karpov at the opening ceremony, and later he would write in Chess Magazine, "After talking for a few minutes with Karpov, it was clear that he was in excellent shape. He looked fitter than usual and in a very happy mood. On the other hand, one unmistakable sign that he hungered for victory was his annoyance that the press considered Kasparov a clear favorite." Yeah, and then maybe the reason for why Karpov was in such a good shape, maybe physically and mentally, well, for starters, he hadn't been that busy with chess in recent months, so he had taken some rest after having had a very good 93 year. So besides beating Timman in that FIDE World Championship, he had won a number of tournaments, including in Dortmund and Dos Hermanos. And then after sort of a rest period, he had only played a match with the Chilean Grandmaster Ivan Morovic in Las Palmas, Gran Canaria. And he had won that one 5-1. And after that match, well, he actually spent a few days completely on his own on a beach. Karpov said about this, "I went to the south of Gran Canaria and was just lying on the beach in the sun, alone at the ocean. This was very good for my nerves. I left there 5 days before this tournament. This was a very important part of my preparation. Just to do nothing. As for my chess, I mostly relied on what I did last year, when I played all these tournaments and especially when I prepared for my match with Jan," referring to Jan Timman. So evidently we did some good work.
Yeah, and it turned out that Karpov was indeed playing the tournament of his life, as I mentioned in the beginning of this podcast, because he won the tournament with a fantastic score of 11 out of 13. And he was clearly above the numbers 2 and 3. So Garry Kasparov came second, and Alexei Shirov, maybe a little bit surprisingly, although he was already in the top 5 of the world ranking, he came third. Together with Kasparov, actually, they shared second place with 8.5 out of 13. And what was definitely a surprise is the fourth place of Yevgeny Bareyev, who was, of course, a strong player, but to score 7.5 out of 13 ahead of a few other big names, that was definitely a surprise. He played a really good tournament. Fifth came Yo Lao-che, and he shared fifth place with Vladimir Kramnik. Both scored 7 out of 13.
Yeah, Lao-che, a young and upcoming player from France, but also connections with Russia. He already spoke Russian, I believe, at the time.
Yes.
And he would later have a successful business career also in Moscow. But in those early and mid-90s, he was a force to reckon with. And in fact, he beat Kasparov in this tournament, and he would also beat Kasparov later.
Yeah, and if you look at who came after Lao-che and Kramnik, these are also huge names. Gata Kamsky, who played a world championship FIDE match against Karpov. Viswanathan Anand, he was, of course, later world champion.
He would also, by the way, play Kasparov for the PCA World Championship a year later.
Yeah, in 95. And then Veselin Topalov, of course, he played for the World Championship as well, as we know from the Toilet Gate episode. And Vasily Ivanchuk, the previous winner, came 10th, only 10th. He scored 6 out of 13. He had a good second half of the tournament, but I think in the early part he failed to shine. And then 11th place was Boris Gelfand. He was a top player as well at the time. And on 12th place it was Miguel Illescas with 4.5 out of 13. Judith Polgar, she was still young, and she didn't have a great tournament. We'll come to that later, I guess, maybe why. But she scored only 4 out of 13. She would do much better in later editions of the tournament. And in 14th place, it was Alexander Belyavsky. He scored 2 out of 13.
Yeah, and there were some interesting individual results among these players as well. For example, in this event, Kramnik, who would later beat Kasparov in the 2000 World Championship in London, famously. In this tournament, the 18-year-old Kramnik scored his first classical win over Kasparov in round 10. However, a day later, he was outplayed by Karpov, like many of his colleagues in that year. And yeah, the rise of Kramnik was also one of the big stories in those years. Kramnik, who had been picked by Kasparov himself, I believe, for the 1992 Olympiad as board 5. And that was the breakthrough tournament for Kramnik, who scored an amazing result there. And within 2 years, Kramnik was also among the top players in the world, as you said. And yeah, the aforementioned Lao-che, he beat Kasparov in what was their first encounter between those two players.
Maybe good to mention that Alexei Shirov, who came in the end, shared second and third. It was Anatoly Karpov who remarked afterwards that he was helped by the fact that all Shirov's opponents first had to play Kasparov and Karpov before they met Shirov. And perhaps this was shown in the standings. I think that's a little unfair. If you look at Shirov's games in this tournament, they were really spectacular. And I think maybe his most spectacular game of all time, his win against Kramnik with the famous rook move, rook to e4, was also played in this tournament. So, yeah, just to say that he was a bit lucky that his opponents got Karpov and Kasparov first is not entirely doing him justice. He played a great tournament.
But to be fair to Karpov, he also admitted that in this successful tournament for him, he was the one who got all the opponents a day later after they had played against Kasparov.
Right, okay.
And in an interview, Karpov said, "This is good because he gives them a hard time."
Okay, fair enough.
So yeah, that's sometimes the way how round-robin pairings work. Well, they always work like that. That certain players they get opponents one day after someone else had those opponents, right? And yeah, in this case, Karpov after Kasparov, and then Shirov after Kasparov and Karpov.
Yeah. Yeah, and Kasparov himself, although he came second, he was definitely not happy with his performance. In fact, in an interview with Dirk-Jan ten Geuzendam in New in Chess magazine, he mentioned this as the worst performance of my career. It's a bit exaggerated, I think, but it shows where his mind was at the time. He was really disappointed that he hadn't won this unique occasion to prove that he was the best tournament player in the world.
I believe there is also a famous quote, actually, where in a certain period, Kasparov had an amazing streak of finishing first or shared first in chess tournaments. And then when he didn't come first in the tournament, he called it something like, he said something like, I lost the tournament.
Yeah.
For Kasparov, maybe it felt as one of his worst tournaments of his career back then. But yeah, for Karpov, as we have mentioned a few times already, it was absolutely his best tournament ever, I guess. And then the question is, of course, how big was this tournament victory if we compare it to other big results in chess history? We are, after all, a chess history podcast. So let me start asking you the question, Arne. Do you think this was the best single ever performance in a chess tournament by a player?
Yeah, it might well be. As I mentioned in the quote in the beginning, Karpov himself says it was of Guinness World Records caliber. So I don't know. I guess it is.
Yeah, at the time it was compared by, for example, Alekhin's score in Sanremo in 1930. And now that we look back at it decades later, we, of course, are also thinking about Magnus Carlsen's victory at the Pearl Spring Tournament in 2009, where Carlsen, in fact, had a performance rating which was a little bit higher than Karpov's, namely 3002. And then I believe we should definitely also mention Fabiano Caruana's victory in 2014 at the Sinquefoot Cup, where he also scored 8.5 out of 10, starting with 7 wins. Karpov, by the way, started with 6 wins in Linares and Fabiano with 7. And there is also a chess statistician who has said something about this.
Yeah, it was Jeff Sonas. He is known for his calculations on ELO ratings. And he confirmed that this was indeed the best tournament performance of all time, above Garry Kasparov's 12 out of 14 in Tilburg, 1989, Lasker's 18 out of 22 in London, 1899. Kasparov again, he scored 10.5 out of 14 in a later edition of Linares in 1999. And then there is Tal's 20 out of 28 performance in the Bled Zagreb Belgrado candidates tournaments of 1959.
Yeah, so maybe let's mention a few of the actual games that were played in this tournament. For me personally, I believe that Karpov himself also played one of his best ever games in Linares 94, and that was his white game against Veselin Topalov, which I recommend everyone to check out and play through.
Yeah, there was also a very attractive game between Kasparov and Anand, Cecilia Najdorf. I think Kasparov won that game. It was a really spectacular one. And then I also remember a pretty horrible blunder of Yevgeny Bareyev. He came fourth in the end, but he lost in the second round in a truly terrible way to Karpov in a drawish position. He blundered and made in one. So Karpov was also a little bit lucky, I guess.
Yeah, and one other thing that I wanted to mention, which was also quite interesting, is about Karpov's win in the final round against Belyavsky. And in his best games collection, he wrote in the introduction, "This game is noteworthy not only in the competitive sense. In it, I was able to employ an opening preparation which had been awaiting its hour for more than 20 years. A unique occurrence in chess history." So Karpov is writing about his move 14h4 in his game with Belyavsky. And the amazing thing about this is that he already had looked at this position for his candidate's final match against Korchnoi in 1974. So maybe he also scored a world record of leaving opening novelty on the shelf and finally using it.
20 years later.
20 years later, And, well, of course, in the modern times, this is completely impossible to ever happen again, for the simple fact that, these novelties don't really occur that much anymore. Everybody's using the same engines and having the same information available. So anything that is discovered somewhere will always be played within a few weeks, maybe even in a title Tuesday, right?
Yeah. So after Karpov's win in this tournament, most commentators were lyrical, very positive about his performance. But some commentaries were very insightful as well to show the situation in the chess world. So Ali Mortazavi wrote the following: "I must express my surprise at the popularity of Karpov's victory and the role reversal which seems to have taken place. In the 1970s, Karpov represented a symbol of success for the old communist regime. Unfortunately for him, the political structure of this country was to collapse, and worse still, he was to have a serious challenger who stood for political change. In the next decade, a young Garry Kasparov highlighted everything that was wrong with what Karpov stood for. Over the next 10 years, he defeated Karpov 3 times in the final of the World Championships. Victory over the chessboard and in the political arena was firmly his." But then he writes, "In 1994, the same qualities which won Kasparov the hearts of many chess fans have strangely begun to work against him. The brashness, arrogance, and supreme confidence now sometimes cause offense instead of admiration. The modern, politically correct chess fan now has a newfound respect for the middle-aged former world champion." So that's a very interesting and nuanced position, I think. And I think, Peter, you found another similarly insightful comment, right?
Yeah, we have Arnold Denker, the American player, writing in Chess Life about this. He mentions Kasparov and says, "He now has so many far-flung interests that it's a tribute to his great genius that his play hasn't suffered more. He now flies all over the world promoting his newest baby, the PCA, which is nothing more than another version of his former creation, the GMA. Were it at all, it might not prove so taxing, but he has also become deeply involved in Russian politics, where the growing turmoil has taken up a good deal of his time and energy. In addition, a failed marriage and the complications involving a divorce have all added to his problems. Is it any wonder his chess has suffered? In the meantime, his closest rival these many years, Anatoly Karpov, has been strictly attending to business. With the assistance of the computer, he has been perfecting his technique as never before, and there are results to prove it. He has finally out-Capablanca'd the great Kappa, a man who invariably made fewer errors than any of his contemporaries, and whose great endgame skill made him the most feared player of his era."
Yeah, I think actually Denker met Capablanca at the time. I think he's a little younger than Kappa was, but he was definitely around when Kappa was still playing. So we've talked about the tournament, but now we come to the most infamous incident, perhaps, of the entire decade, the incident involving Judith Polgar and Garry Kasparov in the well-known touch move incident game. And let's dive right into it.
Yes, this was the game Polgar versus Kasparov in the 5th round of the tournament. And it was also largely covered in the recent Queen of Chess documentary on Netflix. We're talking about, as I said, Judith Polgar, a 17-year-old against the 30-year-old Kasparov, already a world champion for 9 years. And they play this game, and Kasparov is basically outplaying Polgar and reaching a close to winning position. And then comes the famous knight move, where Kasparov moves a knight to the square c5, holds it a little bit, then releases it very briefly, grabs it immediately again, pushes it back because he realizes it would be a blunder, and then spending 3 of his 5 remaining minutes before playing a different move with that knight. And as you can also see in the documentary, Judith actually sees what's going on, and she's a bit shocked, and she looks around. She doesn't protest. She starts to question herself and realizes she cannot prove it. And that probably people won't really believe her. So she actually ends up not protesting. And the game is lost in the end for her.
I was like, looking around that, come on, what's going on? Nobody said anything. And I was not sure how to handle this. So I thought, if nobody says anything, then, maybe I shouldn't say anything.
Yeah, so in her book, From GM to Top 10, Polgar describes the incident and writes about it at length. She writes, "I was playing the world champion, and I didn't want to cause unpleasantness during my first invitation at such an important event. I was also afraid that if my complaint was overruled, I would be penalized on the clock when we were in time pressure. And she continues, the main question that comes to mind is, why did I not say anything? The answer is complex and involves several aspects. Imagine, I was playing at Linares at the age of just 17. I started the game as the underdog and my position was objectively lost. I did not like the prospect of being suspected of trying to win a lost position by launching an unfair accusation against such an outstanding authority as Garry Kasparov. And I certainly did not want my first ever invitation to Linares to be my last. As if all these factors were not enough to inhibit me, I also had some anxieties about what would happen if my protest was overruled. I knew something about a rule according to which the arbiter might take away 2 minutes from my clock, but that was all the time I had left.
So yeah, plenty of reason not to act. The most important one probably that it was very hard to prove what Kasparov did, right? Well, maybe not, because as it turned out, there were actually cameras in the playing hall from a Spanish television crew, from a channel on TV. And the only thing was that maybe Judith didn't immediately think about that, because the thing was the camera that was pointing at their board at the time, there was no cameraman behind them. A detail that was interestingly revealed in the Queen of Chess documentary by her sister Susan. So maybe also because it seemed that the camera wasn't on and nobody was recording at that time, Judith was also not really thinking about that. But that changed in the evening. After the games had finished, players were having dinner in the hotel restaurant, which was quite common in those days. And of course, what happened was also a topic of the conversation. And at some point, the arbiter Carlos Falcon walked to Judith and asked her, "Can I help you with anything?" And yeah, maybe a bit of a funny question maybe. Maybe he was a bit worried about what was being discussed because he had maybe seen it or not seen it. But anyway, yeah, Judith said something about, yeah, well, maybe you can help a little bit. Maybe what about these cameras in the playing hall, right? And that was the start of basically the next chapter in this story, because at some point it was actually discovered that the camera that had been there without a cameraman had actually been recording. The Spanish TV crew had forgotten to switch it off, and it was actually recording the game and also the incident.
Oh, right. And did they get to see that video then?
Well, yeah, that's the weird thing. Not really immediately. For starters, the Spanish TV crew was already back in Madrid the next day or the day after. They had brought the tapes with them, so people couldn't see it. And somehow, I believe that Luis Rentero had checked them before they left, because in a private conversation, he had already admitted that he had seen that Kasparov had let go of the knight.
Right.
However, a few days later, he came with a press release, because there had been so many rumors, and he came with a press release that basically stated that Kasparov was a very correct player, and that this didn't happen, and yeah, people should basically stop talking about this incident. But that was, of course, also not the end of the story. And yeah, as Dirk-Jan ten Geuzenam, the Dutch journalist, writes in New Chess magazine at the time, any sane person reading the letter from Rentero could only conclude that it was written to cover up that Kasparov did release the piece.
Yeah, I must say that Dirk-Jan did a really good journalistic job there. He hits the nail on the head, and he also asks exactly the right questions already back then.
So yeah, somewhere at the end of the tournament, the TV crew returns to Linares with the tape, and a select group of people are actually able to see the video and finally see the proof, yeah, that the knight was let go by Kasparov. And I believe only then she basically really got pissed at Kasparov about what happened, right?
So then what she does, she goes to Kasparov in the hotel bar and she confronts him. I must say, I find this incredibly brave for a 17-year-old girl going to the world champion like that. And she basically asked him, how could you do this to me? And this started basically a lot of anger with Kasparov. He did not appreciate that question at all. And in fact, in an interview with Dirk-Jan after the tournament, he comes back to this point and he says the following: I think a girl of her age should be taught some good manners before making such statements. This afternoon, she told me in the lobby that I had been cheating. She came to me smiling and said, how could you do this? You released the piece. We saw the tape and it's clear. I said I didn't see the tape and that I didn't think I released the piece. And she said, I trusted you, and went, you were cheating us. So I said, fine, if you think I was cheating, we're not talking anymore.
Right. And in fact, as it turned out, Kasparov refused to speak to her for 3 years. He kept saying to reporters that his conscience was clear as he was not aware of his hand leaving the piece, right? I think there was even a cartoon in the magazine at the time.
Yeah, there was a cartoon mocking Kasparov with the quote that my conscience is clear because at no moment did I feel that I had let go of the piece.
Yeah, which I still find a bit of a strange thing to say, by the way. Also, when you look at the incident closely, you see that Garry, he grabs the knight, he puts it on c5, and he actually holds it for maybe a second or two before letting go, and only then grabs it back and removes it back. So it feels like he is already discovering that it's a blunder before he lets go. And maybe because he's sort of shocked by that realization, that might actually have been sort of the body reaction, letting it go then. And when he lets it go, he realizes, no, I shouldn't let it go. And then he grabs it again, right?
Yeah.
So all in all, you can never know for sure, but it feels like it's a bit strange that he really didn't remember or he really didn't feel what happened. Another thing from Polgar's book I found quite remarkable, and I believe she was incredibly gracious when she wrote in the book, I would like to invite you, dear reader, to imagine yourself in Garry's shoes. You are involved in a must-win game, chess fans and media are watching, you play a fine game, and then this accident happens. You are not sure whether or not your fingers fully release the knight, and there is no protest for the 3 whole minutes. So, sort of, giving the reader the opportunity to accept that also for Kasparov it wasn't easy, right? This whole thing.
Yeah, that's a fantastically generous quote from Judith. She didn't have to do that. And to be honest, if you do something wrong, then it's not enough to say that it didn't feel wrong. That's still wrong.
Yeah, and especially 32 years later in the documentary Queen of Chess, Kasparov still called it only a little controversy, saying, I didn't feel that I made something wrong.
Yeah, there was a little controversy there. So I believe that, I didn't feel that my hand actually left the piece. I wouldn't have done that. It's about 1 point. It's if you look at this at the video, it's about 1/10 of a second.
Yeah, personally, I thought it would have been a bit more gracious if he could have just said, well, we've seen the video now. It's been 32 years ago. I was wrong, and I should have admitted it at the time. But I didn't. Something like that, right? But somehow 32 years later, he would still had a hard time admitting it or something. I don't know.
Yeah, no, he should have done the right thing and admitted his mistake. So I think there were 2 other incidents where world champions touched a piece and then released it again, right? And I think you were involved in both?
Yeah, well, at least I was attending and I was filming. Interestingly, Magnus Carlsen, already the best player in the world, he did the same against Alexander Kostenyuk at the World Blitz Championship in 2009, where he basically touched a rook and played another rook. And when Kostenyuk pointed towards him, immediately sort of protesting, Carlsen just resigned and walked away. And interestingly, 6 years later, in 2017 in San Luis, it was Kasparov again who sort of repeated this knight thing in a game against Hikaru Nakamura.
Not again.
Yeah, and his comments were similar too. Kasparov at the time said, I was not sure whether I had left the knight. In Blitz, it is difficult to tell, he told Maurice Ashley. But in that case, Nakamura actually didn't protest either. And his comments were, it's Garry after all. Maybe I'm not treating this event as seriously as he is. I gave him the benefit of the doubt. You hate seeing games decided on blunders like that. So that's the reason why I let it pass.
So we've talked about Kasparov not in his greatest shape, complaining and maybe not apologizing for his touch move against Judith Polgar. But I must say that he also wrote really great things about this tournament in his analysis. And I think those words would definitely be appreciated by the organizer, Luis Rentero. He wanted fighting chess. And in his analysis to the game Kasparov played against Anand, he writes the following. I think that the majority of chess players do not go for the maximum yield. Do not try to squeeze the last drop of juice out of the position, because they are quite rightly afraid that they won't be able to cope with elements no longer under their control. It goes without saying that when you challenge fate, you take grave risks. In very complicated positions, some decisions are bound to be intuitive, or else the player goes willy-nilly for the most plausible move. And the ball being round, it sometimes misses the goal. But I have always been attracted to this courageous approach, because in my eyes, the rational rejection of total football is an artistic, ideological and human betrayal of the game. So I think a great quote from one of the greatest fighters in chess of all time, Garry Kasparov, against Anand, another great fighter. But I must say in this tournament they had one better, and that was Anatoly Karpov, who played fighting chess in the best possible way and won the strongest tournament in history.
Yeah, amazing tournament. Recommend everyone to play through the games that we mentioned, and especially Anatoly Karpov's games. He won many of them in boa constrictor style, and yeah, as you said, scoring his best tournament result ever. So, thanks for the episode, and see you next time.
See you next time.